So the first place we're going to stop off today is this new box down here called Customer Typology. And I'm going to read this out. Active was your most active segment and accounted for 34.7% of bookers over the last 30 days. New customers was the most active segment in the selected benchmark and accounted for 28.1% of bookers over the last 30 days. Does that make complete sense to you, Brad?
Very little, David. I think I could use with a little more insight.
I could understand that. So I'm going to stop sharing and flick us back to our presentation again and take you through what this segmentation is all about.
Great.
So if you think about all of your future customers and their booking history, some of them will be new bookers. The events they will have booked for, it's the first time that they've booked for you, and therefore they're new customers. A big chunk of your customer base will have attended something in the last 18 months, and we'll come back to them in a second. There'll be some people who have attended previously, but over 18 months ago, but less than 3 years ago. And in our segmentation, we call those stale. There'll be lots of arts organizations that think I am stale.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody who hasn't been for at least 3 years, but has now made a booking, is somebody who has lapsed, who has come back. Okay? So new customers, stale and lapsed. Within the 18 months category, we've got 4 different classifications. If you've been once before and you're coming back again, you are once before. If you come twice before, you've become a convertee. If you've been 3 to 9 times before, you're active. And if you've attended a specific venue at least 10 times, you're super active.
But only one of those needs to be in the last 18 months. Oh, perfectly timed.
Absolutely.
Animation, David, I love it.
Absolutely. So I could be super active, but only have been once in the last 18 months because my other 9+ attendances have been more than 18 months ago.
Got it.
So it's a simple and straightforward approach to segmentation based on my level of loyalty to this organization. So what we need to remember, new customers, once before, convertee, then we move into people who are really active, and then the super active. And then if I haven't been active, if I haven't done anything for 18 months, if the gap since my last attendance is between 18 months and 36, I'm stale. If it's more than 3 years, then I've completely lapsed.
And so we can remember that the classification we see in the benchmark tool is defined by essentially the very moment before they made the booking, their most recent booking, right? That is what we're seeing when I look back at this dashboard insights screen and I'm looking at customer typology. It's making a lot more sense to me now, David, that an active booker refers to, that's my largest segment over the past 30 days, but anyone who is active meant that they had had at least that one engagement within 18 months, that one purchase within 18 months before their most recent purchase.
Indeed, that the one bit within that 18 months, but overall, they've done between 3 and 9 bookings, right, in terms of their history with you as an organization.
Right.
So these are absolutely fans of the organization. These are loyal customers who have come at least 3 times to the organization in terms of their booking history. Key thing with the dashboard is, am I normal? And this organization is not normal because compared to the rest of the large presenting organizations, their biggest segment is actually new customers who accounted for 28.1% of bookers. So is this organization normal? No, it's not. It's doing particularly well in terms of engaging its active customers. So if we click on our box, we go in and we get some more detail. And what we see here is the relative numbers of bookers, and key to this is it is bookers, not tickets sold, for each of the different segments. So what we're seeing here, as was just described in the summary, across the segment, across the benchmark, the most the segment with the highest proportion of bookers is new customers, 28.1%. However, for this organization, it's just 15.1%. And then we move over and look at the actives and the super actives. The actives across the benchmark, 22.4%, but this organization, 34.7%. And again, the super actives are those people who've been 10 times or more before, accounting for 27%, as opposed to almost exactly 20% for the segment. So Brad, as a TRG consultant, what would you be saying if you saw this in a client's figures?
Well, the first thing that jumps out at me is the relative success that they're having with their most loyal customers compared to others in the benchmark, the active and the super active. My instinct here would be that this is an organization that has invested in loyalty, that has invested in being able to easily retain and attract their most loyal customers. I would also note, though, that it seems as though there's perhaps opportunity for this organization to think about their stale segments, their lap segments, where they're maybe underperforming in the benchmark just a bit, and a particular question around new acquisition and trying to understand. I'd want to dig a little deeper there, David, to figure out what is, how is this different? Not only is it normal, I can see how it's normal compared to the benchmark, but what would it have been, or what would their proportions have been in other times, in more normal times?
That's a really good question, Brad. And I will get there in approximately 1 minute. I'll just before we do go there, let's look at this gray box here, segment definitions. If we click on this, that just reminds us what all these different segments are. If we look a bit further on the right-hand side, this information here is what you saw on the key metrics box. And then this is new information that we're seeing down here, which is about not bookers, but tickets and the proportions of tickets sold. And it's interesting that our super actives, 34.3% of tickets sold. So although there are less bookers, they represent the highest performing segment in terms of numbers of tickets.
So David, that's a good tie-in to a question that we've got around being able to, look at segmentation about, a booker that has booked lots of events in one transaction, i.e. for like a festival or a season. Does that count as one, or how many instances? And I can see maybe in that tickets box in the bottom right-hand side, we would get a sense of the volume of tickets that they would have purchased. But in terms of reflecting their activity as an active booker, or wherever their segmentation lies, it would be based on the transaction, right? Of that booker, of that household.
Okay, so this is the number of bookers. So whether they've booked once or whether they've booked 5 times, they are a booker once within that. There's the number of bookings they made, which we're not tracking. And then there's the proportions of tickets they sold, which we are tracking down here.
Right.
So we're saying that, super actives are high in terms of the proportion of bookers, but they are booking more tickets as well. They have a higher numbers of tickets per booker. Actives, although they account for 34.7% of bookers, they only, it's very similar, but only 33% of revenue. But that's a higher revenue than the super actives. And that means that our actives are paying more per ticket. So it's likely that our super actives are taking advantage of bundles of tickets.
Yeah, some package discounts. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, not surprisingly, lapsed was your least active segment and represented 0.4% of bookers, which is low, but it's probably the lowest one for virtually every organization. Once somebody hasn't been for 3 years, you're very unlikely to get them back again. Coming back to your question now, this figure for new customers, it's really high in terms of the benchmark. 28.1% across the benchmark are new customers in an unprecedented period of challenge for the performing arts sector. Is that historically high? We can answer that question by clicking on the Change Index tab up here. And that shows us both for this organization, this anonymous organization that we're looking at, and for the benchmark, how are we doing in the last 30 days compared to the same period last year? And what we find is, if we look at the green line for the benchmark, although that 28.1% seems really high, actually it's 11.1% down on what was happening last year.
Yeah, it was even higher a year ago.
It was even higher. And what we're seeing is that across the benchmark as a whole, what's growing are the actives, the super actives, and interestingly, the stales, although they're not growing nearly as much as we're seeing within this individual organization.
So again, another really interesting example with this organization, David, about the strong work that they're doing to connect with their most loyal customers. And even though they are behind in the benchmark in terms of the proportion of new customers that have booked in the past 30 days, relatively, their decline in new customers from the year before is not that far off their peers in the benchmark. This is an organization that has, it looks like, at least within the past year, traditionally would have less acquisition and perhaps would skew more towards having a higher proportion of more loyal customers than their peers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what the data's telling me too. Again, we've got our segment definitions box here, but if we go to the right-hand side of the screen, this is where we see that there is a degree of normality with this organization. In your organization, super active with the segment that showed the greatest growth, 13.2%, and across the benchmark as a whole, super active has seen the greatest growth of 3.7%.
Right.
And then we need to start talking about cakes, Brad.
Yeah, there needs to be cake.
There needs to be cake. We are not comparing carrot cake with carrot cake. We are comparing carrot cake with fairy cake. This organization is, again, doing comparatively well in very strange times. That its cake has shrunk by 89% in terms of size since this point last year. So whilst we're seeing a higher proportion of superactives, for example, in actual number, it's way, way, way lower.
Right, and that's the startling and stark reality that many organizations are in. So while we are able to see glimmers of optimism and good news in here in terms of what is growing and where we are finding connection with loyal customers in this particular case, it is not enough to make up for what are pretty staggering and sobering declines year over year in the volume of both tickets and revenue.